folks, welcome to S3, and we are going to start off with a nice little introductory task into your new world religion that you're going to be studying at National 4 level, which is going to be Buddhism. So we're going to learn some information about Buddhism, the beginning of Buddhism if you like, the founder of Buddhism, and a little bit about his life, which is obviously important. Before we start, just a little word that Buddhism is an Indian religion. It comes from the country of India, and it is, if you like, a daughter of the other main Indian religion, which is Hinduism. So you may notice some similarities between Hinduism and Buddhism, but if you please remember that Buddhism is a religion in its own right, so therefore although there might be similarities, they're not always interpreted in the same way, but I'll keep you right with that as we go along. Okay, so imagine you live in a palace, just like the founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama. He was a wealthy Indian prince. But imagine that within this palace you have absolutely everything that you would ever want, but you're never allowed to leave the palace. How important for you would it be to get out? Okay, how satisfied would you be with your life there, or would you want more? Would you want to know and demand to know what's going on in the world around about you? Because if we think about that, then we'll maybe begin to understand a little bit about Siddhartha Gautama. He was a wealthy Indian prince who, when he was very, very young, his father had got some wise men in to foretell the future of what he was going to do with his life. All the wise men said that Siddhartha Gautama was going to grow up to be a great leader, just like his father, but the one wise man that his father really wanted to hear from was a man called Asita. And Asita came in, and yet he saw all the same things that the other wise men saw, but he also saw something different. He said, yes, he could grow up to be a great leader, a great king like yourself, or he could choose a different path, which would be to be a great religious leader and a great leader of men. Now, faced with that, the king decided that he was going to do his utmost to make sure that Siddhartha Gautama never left the palace to become this holy man. He wanted him to grow up to be just like him, and that's exactly what he decided to do. So from now on, we're going to be learning a little bit about the Buddha, a little bit about Siddhartha Gautama. Okay, so there was once a king called Suddhodana, okay, and a queen named Mahamaya, but we tend to call her Maya for short. And they lived in the 6th century BCE in India. They were a wealthy family who owned lots of properties and lots of land in this northern part of India. Okay, they had a baby, and they were very, very proud of this baby. They knew it was going to be a special baby because Queen Maya had had some dreams, some prophecies before her baby was born, telling her that this baby was going to be very special indeed. In order to make sure that the baby and his son grew up and would never leave the palace, the king took drastic action. He knew that if his son would become a holy man, if he found out that life for most people was very hard, then he would leave. Okay, so the king decided that if he kept his son in isolation, he would become a king like him. So basically, he built him a palace where Siddhartha could have absolutely every single thing he wanted. He would never desire anything, it would all be delivered to him. And he also made sure that in this palace, the young prince experienced nothing that would make him sad. So no death, no illness, no decay, no sadness. They were all removed before Siddhartha got to see them. So Siddhartha grew up, and as was the custom as a teenage boy, he was married off to a beautiful princess, and he had a son who they named Rahula, and everything was absolutely perfect for him until he reached the age of 29. And at the age of 29, he really wanted to find out what life was like outside the palace. So he managed to persuade his servant to take him out of the palace, and under cover of night they sneaked out and went down into the nearest village, and Siddhartha was to see some things down there which were to change his life forever. Okay, so in the pictures there you can see that he sees 4 different things. He sees an old man, he sees suffering, he sees death, and the last picture, which might look a little bit unusual to you, is a picture of an Indian holy man. Okay, so old age, this was the first thing he saw. He saw an old man walking down the road. He was bent over, his hair was white, he was groaning and moaning in pain. And initially he said to his servant, he said, Channa, tell this man to straighten up. I mean, he's being very, very lazy walking there. Tell him to go and get a job and be happier. And he then said something silly like, who's painted his hair white? But he didn't understand because he'd never seen age or old age at all. So he didn't understand that what he was looking at was a man who was, much, much older. His hair had turned from black until white. He was suffering from the pains that you get with the older age. And Channa had to explain to him that this was what he was seeing. This was old age. And Siddhartha was rather shocked because he'd never seen this before. He really couldn't understand it. So they went a bit further and he saw the second sight. And this was actually a man that was lying at the side of the road with a begging bowl. And the man was lying there and he was covered in sores and pustules and boils. And he looked really terrible. And he had no choice but to lie in the road. He was hoping that someone would come along and put some food into his begging bowl, and that would be what he would eat. And Siddhartha again was sort of saying, he's very lazy, tell him to get up and go and get a job. And Channa had to explain to him that this man was ill, he was very sick, and because of the sickness he couldn't get a job, and because he couldn't get a job he couldn't have any money, and because he hadn't any money he hadn't a roof over his head and he couldn't pay for a doctor. So he was sort of stuck in a cycle of suffering, and this was the only option to him, was to lie in the road and hope that somebody would be kind enough to feed him for that day. So again, Siddhartha Gautama didn't understand this, was confused by this. He'd never seen this type of suffering before. The third sight that he saw was death. And what he actually saw was a funeral procession. He saw a body that was wrapped in linens being carried on the shoulders of men as they went through the town. He saw the women walking behind the dead body, and they were crying and wailing because they were so sad, and they were showing their grief, and they were carrying the body outside the village so that they could put the body on a funeral pyre and burn it, cremate it, which is the way that they that's the way that they have a funeral in India, is through cremation. But again, Siddhartha Gautama, he didn't like the noise of the women. He said he didn't like the song that they were singing, and Channa had to explain to them that they weren't singing a song, they were crying in grief because somebody very special to them had died and had passed on. And again, this was very new to Siddhartha Gautama. He didn't understand it. And by now he was actually getting really annoyed because he was wondering how all these things had been happening all around about him, and yet he didn't know about it. His father, the king, had never explained these things to him, and he was getting really quite angry. Okay? Now, the fourth sight he sees is a holy man who's walking towards him. He's very calm, he's at peace, he has a smile on his face. And Siddhartha Gautama is really quite angry with this man. You know, he's thinking to himself, how can this man be smiling and look so calm with all this suffering and disease and death all around about him? And he realized that this man must know something that he didn't know. He realized this man must have the answer to the questions that had been really bothering him on this visit to this village. And he decided that he wanted to know what that holy man knew. So he decided that he wanted to become a holy man as well. Okay. Now, before you go on to do any of the other tasks, Siddhartha Gautama went back to the palace again, and he made a very important discovery. He realized that if he went back to the palace and he stayed in the life that the king had given him, that he would never ever find out why there was suffering in the world, why people died and why people got old. And so therefore he decided that he would have to leave the palace and he would have to go in search of his answers. Okay, so he does that. He kisses his son goodbye. He kisses his wife goodbye, and then with the help of Channa, he leaves the palace. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so the next thing to do is to create a storyboard or a poster of the Buddha's early life up to and including the 4 sites. The 4 sites are very important, folks, because they are the catalyst. They are the reason why Siddhartha Gautama leaves the palace and goes in search of the answers to his questions. And when he's sorting out these answers, when he's looking for these answers, this will eventually lead him to the start of Buddhism. So the 4 sites are the reason why there is Buddhism in the first place. Okay? Now, once you've done the poster or storyboard, I want you to answer the 2 questions there on the task. So explain how he felt in his early life and explain how he felt and what he learnt at each of the